Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, our second Dean's Lecture for 2016. I acknowledge the elders, families and descendants of the Wurundjeri people who have been the custodians of these lands for many generations. And I acknowledge the land on which we meet today was the place of age-old ceremonies, of celebration, of initiation, of renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of this university. So tonight's a very special night indeed because it's Professor Leslie Farrell's inaugural professorial address for the University of Melbourne. Leslie is the Associate Dean Research here in the Graduate School and is a Professor in Language and Literacy Education. Prior to joining us in 2014, she had the equivalent role in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Technology in Sydney and has previously had appointments at Monash and Deakin. And I welcome all her former colleagues here who I've met, a few have met already. Leslie is clearly recognised internationally and nationally as a leader in the field of language and literacy education. And many of you know that, but focusing specifically on language and social change in globalising contexts. Her focus on the development of theoretical perspectives in the mobilisation of knowledge across disciplinary, across professional, across geographical and political boundaries is matched by a concern with practical issues surrounding the way that professional knowledge is mobilised at local sites. Leslie's widely published and her two most recent books are Knowledge Mobilisation and Educational Research, Politics, Languages and Responsibilities, and the second, Educating the Global Workforce, Knowledge, Knowledge Work and Knowledge Workers. In tonight's lecture, Leslie will explore how the digital revolution is fundamentally changing our understanding of working literacies. I've asked my colleague, Professor Joe Lobianco, to move a vote of thanks at the conclusion of the lecture, but before handing over to Leslie, I do want to acknowledge the extraordinary work she has done in the short time that she's been here as Associate Dean Research, working with John Hattie and Lynn Yates, Joanna Wynne and the whole Melbourne Education Research Institute team, enhancing our research capabilities, and I think our successes in recent rounds reflect her expertise and the work of colleagues, and I want to acknowledge that, Leslie.
Thanks. Thank you everybody for coming. I'd also like to acknowledge that we meet on Aboriginal land and to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. In education, we often talk about work as if the details of work don't matter or can be taken for granted. And we talk about the workplace as if it can be treated as generic. These seem to me to be dangerous assumptions. If education is expected to provide answers to the problems that work presents to society, then we need to put some time into understanding work and workplaces. Specifically, I think we need to try and understand manufacturing work and how it's changing. So I want to begin by introducing you to Mary and Bill. I met them at a textile factory I called AFM, Australian Fabric Manufacturers. They'd agreed to be participants in a research project I was doing there, focusing on the literacy practice, the reading and the writing, through which people demonstrate their competence in the textile clothing and footwear industry. At the time, I thought this project was going to be about literacy and skill. Mary was a mender and she supervised the mending room. Mending was physical work. This picture's from the 1920s, but things hadn't changed much by Mary's day. Like the women in the picture, Mary sat at a large table. Her chair moved along runners from one end of the table to the other. Her tools are really small. All the menders kept their burlers and scissors in the palm of their hand and their domestic sewing needles between their index finger and their thumbs. Their job was to spread the fabric out on the table, 600 or 700 metres of it, check it against a really strong light and mend it. The menders needed to know what to look for. Let me give you an example. Sometimes the wrong colour thread was tied into the warp, so you have a single white thread where a grey thread should be for the entire length of the roll, for 600 or 700 metres. To mend it, they slip their domestic sewing needle from behind the single faulty thread and gently pull it through behind the weft. and then they replace every single tiny loop that the electronic looms made with the single grey thread in their needle. The menders believed that to know how to mend a fault, you had to know how faults happen. It might be that the warpers had made a mistake in reading a new or complex pattern so that the pattern doesn't accurately repeat itself over the width of the fabric. Or it might be that the tyers had made an error tying in the wrong colour yarn halfway through a roll of fabric so the pattern changes midway through the length. Or it might be that despite the newly automated technology, the loom doesn't detect a yarn out and so continues to weave hundreds of metres of fabric with a single thread missing. Or it might be that a thread has been stripped on the loom, leaving a knot of stripped fibres that need to be carefully unravelled, pulling through and smoothed over. Whatever it was, the menders took their domestic sewing needle and they mended it. I began this project in the late 1990s when automation was already well underway, and my focus was on the new competency standards. These were standards that were intended to ensure that Australian industry could be internationally competitive by assuring the quality of our manufacturing. But mending didn't feature. There were no formal competencies in mending, and there was no formal training. There was no historic apprenticeship and there was no new traineeship. What Learning the Menders did, they organised for themselves. So learning wasn't formalised, but it was serious. Mary was the mending room supervisor, so she taught the new menders. She showed them how to hold their tools. She started them with the simplest fabrics and the simplest weaves, and she taught them the kinds of faults that can happen, how to look for them, and what techniques to adopt to mend them. As they became more familiar with the principles of pattern construction and fabric production, she gave them more difficult jobs. The industry provided no formal manuals for mending, but the menders prepared their own mending manual. Many generations of mending supervisors at AFM contributed to the manual. It had started in the 1960s. By the time I saw it, it was a large ring binder which needed 2 hands to lift. It began with typed descriptions of mending techniques. Next to those descriptions were photographs the menders had taken of experienced menders performing those techniques. Samples of the faulty fabrics were kept in plastic sleeves so that menders could take the fabric out and examine it and check it against the fabric they were working on. But the manual was hidden from view on a shelf under Mary's desk. Supervisors from the traditional textile trades had laughed at the mending manual. They didn't think it should be dignified as knowledge or expertise, so the menders kept it hidden. But when I was there, this was about to change. About halfway through my time on this project, Mary was asked to attend the Action Learning Team meeting. Mary was in her early 50s when I met her. She'd been a mender with the company since she was 17. She'd been a mending room supervisor for over 10 years. But the Action Learning Team meeting was the first formal meeting she'd ever been asked to attend. There was a reason she was asked to attend this one. The company was aware that it was not achieving its production targets and was getting unsatisfactory ratings in its quality audits conducted by imported automotive clients. It was also worried that it might not meet the International Quality Standard 9000 accreditation when they applied for it later in the year. Without these certifications, the company would lose its major clients, the national automotive companies. And if it lost those clients, it would have to close. The problem AFM had with quality audits was the lack of documented problem solving. So the focus of the Action Learning Team was on problem solving, specifically the implementation of an 8-step problem solving protocol. The protocol was attractive for 2 reasons. The first was that it aimed to make creative thinking about problems systematic. The second, and probably more urgent at this point, was that it could be documented. The written 8-step plan could be included in the quality audit as documented evidence of systematic, collaborative problem solving. Problem solving has been an enduring challenge in manufacturing. Its importance only increased with the automation of production processes. At this point, at least, the machines could make the products, but they couldn't solve the problems. So you can probably guess why Mary was invited to the Action Learning Team meeting. She was the owner of the Mending Manual. It was the systemic approach to problem solving. It clearly involved collaboration and learning, and it could be quickly turned into 8-step problem-solving plans. Documenting problem-solving was not an issue in the Mending room. That's how the Menders built their knowledge base and satisfied themselves that they were doing the best work they could. But documented problem-solving was an issue at AFM and in manufacturing more generally. To understand what kind of a problem-solving was at AFM and elsewhere, I want to introduce you to Bill. Like Mary, Bill was invited to the Action Learning Team meeting. Bill was the warping shed supervisor. He'd completed his apprenticeship in the UK before coming to Australia. Bill's apprenticeship was in lace making. Lace making sounds like a delicate trade, but it wasn't. It was physically demanding and highly technical work. To be a lace maker, you needed to be able to work with and solve problems with large and complex machines. That's what Bill was good at, and that's what problem solving meant to Bill. If he met a problem he couldn't solve himself, he would go straight to the most senior managers, explain the problem, and tell them what to do about it. Up until now, this had been an entirely successful approach. Bill did not come willingly to the Action Learning Team meeting. He was instructed to attend the meeting and to produce an 8-step problem-solving document which demonstrated structured problem-solving, teamwork and learning. He was given a template with headings and questions and ruled lines indicating just how much writing he was expected to do. The Action Learning Team meeting was convened by workplace English literacy educators, Sally and Margaret. You might be surprised to learn just how much English literacy education goes on in workplaces. Some of that literacy education is managed by literacy educators in dedicated workplace literacy programs. Some of it's conducted in other workplace learning settings, like the Action Learning Team meeting I'm talking about here, where the literacy instruction is situated within the new practices of the organisation. And some of it's learned collaboratively in workplace settings where colleagues teach each other anything from very basic word recognition to sophisticated literacy practices. Keiko Yakasawa and Steve Black have documented this kind of highly situated, highly embedded collaborative literacy and numeracy learning in a variety of Australian manufacturing workplaces. Sally and Margaret were normally involved in workforce literacy teaching, but when I met them, they were struggling with a much more concrete goal. They were responsible for ensuring that there were enough documented 8-step problem-solving plans to meet AFM's quality registration requirements. Management believed that AFM was struggling to document their problem-solving processes because the workforce was not sufficiently literate to complete the paperwork. They had some basis for this assumption. Literacy levels in the manufacturing sector have traditionally been much lower than the adult population as a whole. Even now, the 2013 OECD data indicates that while adult literacy levels have risen slightly, literacy standards in the manufacturing sector in Australia remain the lowest of any occupational group. And increasingly, employers experience it as a problem. The Australian Industry Group's recent survey indicates that 93% of manufacturing employers are concerned about the literacy and numeracy levels of the workforce. There is no question that literacy, learning and problem solving are intimately connected in all contemporary workplaces, including factories, and they have been for a long time. But it's not a simple connection. I want to focus on Bill's contribution to the Action Learning Team meeting to show you what I mean. The modified transcript I'm going to show you is a tiny part of a linguistic ethnography I did at AFM. The picture on the screen is a warping machine with a set of buggies in place. The frame with the creels of yarn is a buggy. This will become relevant. Sally and Margaret are workplace literacy educators and Matt is a systems manager. Everyone is employed one way or another by AFM. Matt starts off in quite an encouraging way. His job depends on quality assurance requirements being met. It's in his interests. So Matt says, I think, Bill, you've gone a fair way too on a couple of yours, haven't you? Bill, yeah, me and Margaret, yeah, got together. I've worked out quite a bit of lost downtime and costing, unloading. So far, so good. Bill's identified the buggies project as a real problem and he's identified the solution. He needs another set of buggies. This would allow him to get workers to set up one set of buggies for the next job while the original set of buggies was used for the current job. For Sally and Matt and AFM management, however, the desired outcome is not a new set of buggies. It's a properly documented 8-step problem-solving plan. So Sally cuts to the chase. To what extent are you following the framework of that 8-step guideline that Andy, the human resource manager, put out originally in that book, where particularly step 7, where it's got the action plan and it's got who, when, where, and so on? Are you using those at all? Sally, as a good workplace literacy educator, goes directly to the generic characteristics of the written text. Bill, no, I'm just using this one. Sally, yeah, so are you following that paperwork there? Well, the paperwork might be completed, but it won't be by Bill. Yeah, I don't know. Are you, Margaret? I'm sorry, I've asked the wrong person. I'm writing it all out and giving it to Margaret, that's all. Margaret, I'll give you an example. This is one that we're working on that Bill's talking about. And these are really all his figures. Oh, I see. And so when we get together, that's the sort of thing we do, writing up all these things, but, oh, okay. Then gradually translating it onto here. Margaret has a pile of 3 folders. Matt's sort of saying Margaret's an excellent facilitator. So Margaret's producing the text, taking Bill's back of an envelope calculations and the yellow post-it notes and turning it into the kind of 8-step problem-solving plan that the relevant quality assurance agency would recognise. Given the urgency of the documentation, Sally is prepared to beat a strategic retreat on the matter of who has actually put pen to paper. But she doesn't want to relinquish the collaborative dimension of the problem solving. This is, after all, supposed to be a team. And is there actually a group involved with doing that, or yourself? No, because I find it's too awkward for Margaret if she's talking to individual people that's only been here 9 months. Yeah. So they don't know what they're talking about half the time, and they're giving Margaret the wrong information. So I said to Margaret, it's better if she comes to me and I can give her the right times and all this, you know. Yep. Margaret. But what we talked about last time, though, was that it really had to be set down. So what I've done is write it down. Yeah. Your name, and Nick, who's been involved in talking about some of it too, and Bashir. Yeah. Now, I did have one, but you felt he's not in that area now. No. So you prefer to have Chris? Yeah. And Matt, your name was now put onto that one as well. Margaret. So that's a bit of a way that things are operating, though. So we haven't really started off with a team that's taking responsibility for it. So I guess, in a way, it's evolving as it goes. Sally, well, yes. It goes on, but I'll stop. I want to make just a couple of observations, although that transcript does repay quite exhaustive analysis. The first observation is that it's clearly difficult to separate the literacy practice of problem solving from the work practice of problem solving. It's managed here through the mediation of a workplace literacy educator. It relies very heavily on all the participants being in the same physical location. The second observation is that it's not clear in this or in the more extended transcript how much Bill can't write and how much Bill won't write. What is obvious is that Bill's status as the go-to person with expertise about warping is at stake here, and he doesn't want to relinquish it. Nor is he able to construct a convincing version of collaboration that will preserve his status while meeting the requirements of problem-solving protocols. Something significant was happening. A shift from knowledge being in the head of an individual to knowledge being in a text, and from knowledge drawing on one expert's expertise to knowledge being produced collaboratively. AFM closed in 2009. This study was conducted about 20 years after automation and the challenges of collaboration became a feature of work generally and manufacturing in particular. Throughout Victoria, factories like AFM were closing. The focus at this time was not yet on smart networked factories, it was on smart machines. Shoshana Zuboff introduced the idea of the informated workplace. I'm quoting from her classic book, which some of you will know, called In the Age of the Smart Machine. She says, the informated workplace, which may no longer be a place at all, is an arena through which information circulates, information to which intellectual effort is applied. The quality, rather than the quantity of effort, will be the source from which added value is derived. A new division of learning requires another vocabulary, one of colleagues and co-learners, of exploration, experimentation and innovation. Jobs are comprehensive, tasks are abstractions that depend upon insights and synthesis, and power is a roving force that comes to rest as dictated by function and need. She wrote that in 1988. Before the widespread diffusion of the internet, and almost 10 years before Sally and Margaret struggled with the Action Learning Team meeting. It does, all the same, predict the terms of the struggle. It's a struggle around quality rather than quantity, around collaboration rather than the reification of individual expertise, and around innovation rather than established professional knowledge. And it's around the changing nature of power in the workplace, as the new literate practices challenge established hierarchies of power. Bill was just one casualty of a revolution in work practice which shift power from those who hold knowledge in their bodies and their practices to those who abstract and produce knowledge through literacy practice. I'm going to stop talking about work for a minute and focus on literacy. So far, I've deliberately talked about literacy rather than about reading and writing. That's because, at least in relation to workplace literacy research, the unit of analysis is generally the literacy practice or the literacy event. In the AFM project, I was interested in the completion of the 8-step problem-solving plan as a literacy activity, and I focused on the symbiotic relationship between reading and writing that needs to happen if it's to be accomplished. Zuboff noticed that the manufacturing workers could only access the information they needed to do their work by reading manuals, reading printouts and texts on computer screen. From her point of view, authority and expertise have been transferred from the people to the written text. The workplace needed a lot of readers to receive information and instruction, but it needed only a few writers. And those few writers in factories were only expected to write routine texts, even if some of them, like Mary, went well beyond that expectation. At this point, reading was the literate practice that mattered. And as Deborah Brandt has pointed out, when literacy was assessed, it was reading that went proxy for literacy. This is still the case. The International Adult Literacy and Problem-Solving Benchmark is PIAC, the Program of International Assessment of Adult Competencies. Some of you will be familiar with the OECD's PISA program, which is very influential in debates about the achievement of school systems. PIAC is the OECD's assessment of adults. The domains are literacy and numeracy and problem solving in technologically rich environments. Australia does okay on PIAC rankings. We're well ahead of the other English-speaking countries like the US and UK, and not too far behind Canada. And according to the OECD's analysis of the PIAC data, generally speaking, people in Australia have the skill levels needed to do the jobs they currently have. But, according to the Australian Industry Group, they don't. There's a lot to be teased out about this difference of view. I only want to mention two things here. The first is that manufacturing is in the midst of very rapid transition, so work organisation is very diverse and has shifted from the time the PIAC panel set its benchmarks to the time they published their results. The second is that PIAC does not test the productive dimension of literacy. It doesn't test the ability to write or to produce written text. The expert panel recognised this as a major limitation, and it's looking for ways to assess this, but it doesn't do it yet. Some manufacturing employers are coming to understand the fundamental importance of embedded writing as their companies become increasingly involved in collaboration. They are becoming aware of the writing that establishes and maintains relationships with suppliers, freelancers and clients, the writing that collaborates to identify and solve a problem, the writing that allows a multifunctional team to collaborate even though they work in different time zones and different geographical location. Or at least they're aware of it when it goes wrong. It's this kind of writing, far more than reading, that is the compelling challenge for manufacturing workforces. Writing literacy is fundamental to economic activity. The commercial value of writing is that it allows knowledge to be made and traded on a global scale. Deborah Brandt argues that many American workers, perhaps most of them, spend at least half their workday with their hands on their keyboards and their minds on their audiences in the act of writing. We know this is true for professional work. However, many people would make an exception for manufacturing. In manufacturing, surely, if only workers could read well enough to follow clearly written and comprehensive standard procedures, then surely that would do. Of all the sectors, manufacturing is most obviously based on standardised, routinized work practices. Manufacturing is about producing many identical copies of the same item. But we are at the dawn of Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution. I feel compelled to explain what is meant by Industry 4.0. I feel this obligation even though I'm aware that the explanation that I'm about to give will be either utterly mystifying or absurdly simplistic, depending on how familiar you are with these ideas. But I'm going to do it anyway. When I talk about Industry 4.0, what I'm talking about are the effects of the convergence of the technologies associated with robotics, the Internet of Things, and the Internet of Services. What's revolutionary about it is the convergence. These technologies can, and to some extent already do, operate as integrated networks. That convergence across time, geographical distance, and supply chains makes smart factories possible. Smart factories are factories where cyber-physical systems do more than produce products. They also monitor and modify the entire production process as it goes along. Individual robotic components communicate with each other, and sometimes with people, to make decentralised decisions on a moment-by-moment basis. These networks generate vast amounts of data. That data supports self-monitoring quality assurance across a production network. But the same data allows the company to automatically offer personalised within-sale and after-sales services to people who've purchased a product. Their aim is to establish and maintain customer relationships indefinitely. Essentially, almost any production task that can be codified in a set of instructions or rules can now be performed by robots. That's not to say that it is being performed by robots, or that it definitely will be, just that it can be. All the same, it's fair to say that in manufacturing, physical labour, even skilled physical labour, is far, far, far less important than it used to be. Obviously, this is a technological revolution, perhaps as significant as the steam-powered industrial revolution. But there's more to this than a technological revolution. The move towards smart factories is also a social revolution. What I mean by this is that there are fundamental changes in what counts as manufacturing work for people, how the human component of factory work is organised, how people relate with each other at work, who does the work, and under what conditions. There'll be work for people, even in manufacturing, but they'll have different tasks. The work is likely to be precarious and not necessarily full-time, and there may not be as many recognisable jobs overall. And that work, virtually all of it, will rely on literacy. We're now at the point where literacy is becoming the new form of labour. Work practices are increasingly becoming literacy practices. This is changing work, but it's also changing literacy. What AFM was struggling with in the mid-90s was the challenge of producing fabric of a consistently high standard, large quantities of fabric with no variation, at a competitive price. But the current challenge for manufacturing is not standardisation, it's customisation. Literacy, learning and problem solving are more fundamental than they were for AFM, but they're happening in a context which is becoming less about producing a standardised product and more about producing a personalised product. This is making a difference to what people do at work and the ways that work is organised. It's making a difference to how people are now and will increasingly read and write for work. It's tempting to move into speculative fiction at this point. Technological change attracts predictions, and there's no shortage of predictions about the impact of Industry 4.0 on jobs. For instance, the Boston Consulting Group predicts that by 2025, that's in 9 years, networked robots will be performing 30 to 35% of all tasks, including, of course, the tasks that Mary and Bill performed. In some industries, up to 85% of tasks are automatable. But just because a task is automatable doesn't mean that it will be automated. There are a number of factors that contribute to the uptake of robotics in manufacturing: the industrial relations traditions, the cultures of the community, and many others. One critical factor is, of course, the cost of labour. This shows you what I just said. You can see here that the automotive industry is well past the inflection point. So we're not talking about factories of the future here, we're talking about factories of the present. And I want to show you an example of a new kind of factory from an increasingly diversifying automotive industry. But before I do that, there's one point I want to make. I said that the whole orientation of manufacturing is changing from standardisation to customisation. This is why. This is a smile curve of a value chain. The vertical axis is the value added at different stages of the supply chain. The horizontal axis is the time from conception of the product to when its potential to generate profit is completely exhausted. You can see that the highest value is added in the early stages such as the development of a new concept and the research and development around the manufacture of novel key components. The production of the physical product doesn't add much value at all, but value is also added in later stages like marketing, branding, and customer service. And with that, as an act of faith in the marvels of modern technology, I'm going to show you a promotion video of an automotive factory in the United States where automotive production is experiencing a resurgence. This is a video of Local Motors. Local Motors is a disruptor. Its business model challenges traditional automotive manufacturers who have relied on large footprint, high volume, standardised production. Local Motors is about highly customised, low volume, collaborative production. It exploits both the technological and the social dimensions of Industry 4.0.
Vehicles define energy and materials needs more than any other segment of the global economy. Usage of local energy and materials is constrained by a lack of locally relevant vehicle solutions. Global collaboration, local energy, and new technology have set the conditions to revolutionize and disrupt automotive innovation.
The Microfactory program is Local Motors' approach to how to do design, development, and distribution of vehicles differently. Behind me is Local Motors' unique microfactory, a first of its kind, 40,000 square foot facility where we build the Rally Fighter, a local vehicle made for a local economy. The designers of the Rally Fighter, Local Motors' global online design and development community, saw the opportunity to fill a niche that had never been addressed, a premium, authentic off-road vehicle with on-road capability. The leaders of the city of Phoenix and the Gila River Indian tribe helped to make this vision a reality by allowing us to create a microfactory.
We can produce up to 250 cars per year in this location, and if we want to increase the capacity, then we just extend either the number of hours worked or we can just make an extension to the microfactory itself.
The Microfactory program and its technology is powered by an open development platform called the Forge. The Forge is a place where enabling core systems are developed both faster, better, and cheaper.
Each microfactory is the result of a unique partnership between local businesses, governments, and our global charter partners. Locally, the partners will focus on energy, infrastructure, information technology, logistics, and materials, while Local Motors will bring these elements together in the co-creation of relevant vehicles tailored for the needs of a specific market. This generates job creation, efficient resource usage, rapid technology advancement, global leadership, and unparalleled civic pride.
So they found a small company in Arizona called Local Motors, and they gave them a test. You have 1 month to design a new combat support vehicle, and you've got 3 months to build it.
We've developed the XC2V in 5 months in a budget that is less than $1 million, when a typical OEM development would cost you $500 million or a multi-billion dollars. It took us 5 months, when normally it would take you 5 or 10 years. So we just proved to the world that the process that we're using is just far more efficient than what is currently out there.
The Microfactory program empowers cities, states, regions, nations, and businesses to plan for and build their own locally relevant vehicle ecosystem. Join Local Motors to build the microfactories of the future.
There's a lot to be said about Local Motors, but the point that I want to make is that what makes Local Motors possible is writing. Local Motors is about collaborative problem solving. It's about bringing together literally thousands of people, its internal teams, the online design community and the physical community, to do the research and development that imagines its product and solves the pragmatic problems of the product's production, on time and at a competitive price. It also relies on collaboration for the more mundane tasks of getting the product to market. It relies on a local and global community of partners, suppliers, investors, fabricators, engineers and designers to make the relationships, have the ideas, learn the new skills and solve the problems in order to manufacture and sell products that are nearly always novel. That's a lot of problems and a lot of collaboration. And all of this is done through writing and the associated reading. Writing establishes and maintains the creative relationships. It establishes and tests claims to expertise in what may be largely anonymous communities, and it identifies, articulates and solves problems collaboratively. Writing establishes and maintains commercial relationships. It navigates disputes around intellectual property, which can be tricky in a situation like this when most people aren't employees. And it does much more besides. Local Motors is created through writing, and it is awash with writing. In 2010, Local Motors clocked 8,000 interactions a day on its design platform alone. It has many, many more now. Of course, more traditional work organisation also needs writing to create the ligatures between suppliers, clients, and so on. But large organisations do generally have some structure in which these unambiguously working relationships are established and maintained. At Local Motors, the line between work and play is blurring. For many people, these interactions are a hobby. They have day jobs, maybe even in the automotive industry, or they go to school or university. But for many others, this or somewhere like this is where their paid work is coming from. The writing they do here is their work practice. Their ability to make a living is at stake. They need to be able to establish their expertise as a sheet metal worker or a draftsman or an electrician or a textile maker. They need to be able to put their ideas into words quickly and respond quickly in writing to other people's ideas if they are to become the supplier that this model relies on. Local Motors might seem like something of an outlier. It makes highly specialised products for a niche market. Not everyone is interested in customised off-road vehicles, although having the United States as a client could change the scale of the operation. Most people who want to buy a car don't want to be quite so hands-on. And this is clearly not the only automotive manufacturing model that is emerging in response to the networking of digital technologies. But it's not merely a curiosity either. In the last 2 years, Local Motors has developed relationships with 2 new global companies. General Electric has partnered with Local Motors to produce customised home appliances. Fridges, indeed. A much more mainstream market. Siemens is partnering with Local Motors to develop more collaborative platform software. This new writing-reliant distributed workforce collaboration model seems to me to have quite a way to go, which is not to say that I know where it's going. I don't. And it's not to say that I think it will become the dominant model in manufacturing. I have no idea. There is a revolution in the social technologies of work, and this could end anywhere. But what is clear is this revolution presents both literacy research and literacy education with some significant challenges. One of the main goals of education in general, and literacy education in particular, is to give people the best chance of making a dignified living. The work of writing is no longer confined to people who like to do it, like Mary and her Mending Room colleagues. Writing, not just routine writing like job cards and problem-solving templates, but exhaustive collaborative writing with people you don't know and can't see, is becoming the fundamental work practice, even for the next generation of Bills who wish it wasn't. And this kind of writing is not the kind of writing we teach or assess. As literacy researchers, we don't even really understand it very well. In some ways, its collaborative character makes it more like speaking, but its abstraction from the local context, its durability in the virtual workspace, and the things that are potentially at stake with each utterance associate it with the tradition of writing. If traditional manufacturing workers are to have any chance of negotiating a dignified living in manufacturing in the very near future, then we need to learn to understand these new literacy practices, and we need to help them learn how to write them. The Local Motors model relies on writing, so it relies on people as much as digital technologies. There are, of course, alternatives, and you may be familiar with the Tesla factory, which has perhaps not so many people. But if we can't help the manufacturing workforce to write, we might end up with something much more like this. Thank you.